Welcome to AntArctic Stories, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes into the rich world of people who live, work, and undertake daring expeditions in the polar regions. My name is Heather Thorkelson, and I'll be your host today. Theo Crutchley-Mack was born in Bristol in 1994 and has lived in various parts of the UK, including Yorkshire, Cornwall, and Pembrokeshire. At the age of 16, he became the first teenager to design a coin for the Royal Mint, which was later released into circulation throughout the UK. This achievement sparked a specific interest in drawing, which he continues to explore in his work today. Theo studied a Bachelor of Arts in Drawing at Falmouth University in Cornwall. This location's history allowed him to develop a keen interest in ruins and abandonment, which is now linked closely to his practice. The detrimental effects of nature on man-made surfaces leave small insights into the fragmented history of abandoned landscapes. Theo spends many hours studying these places by drawing and painting on location, in all variations of weather and light. These drawings then inform more sustained works created in his studio at a later date. As Theo states, these ruins have a profound effect on the atmosphere of a landscape, and it is this which I attempt to capture within my drawing. The obsession with abandonment and decay is a consistent theme in Theo's work. In 2018, Theo completed an artist's residency in the remote outpost of Grytviken. Grytviken is on the island of South Georgia, home to the abandoned whaling industries that were active from 1904 to 1966. Now lying in ruin, the stations are unique sites of industrial heritage amongst a vast glacial wilderness. Theo strives to record the obscure landscape, often abandoned and remote. Located over 7,500 miles from home, these industrial landscapes were an idyllic source of inspiration to begin his most ambitious series of paintings to date. Having completed this 2-month residency for the South Georgia Heritage Trust, an exhibition of paintings and drawings is now touring around several locations in the UK, Falkland Islands, and South Georgia. There is also a 68-page hardback book dedicated to the project, with words from Theo about the project and photographs of his time at this globally significant location. Theo Crutchley-Mack, welcome to AntArctic Stories.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, you're actually the second artist that we've had on the program, but your particular residency is quite different from the last gentleman that we spoke to, because it was on South Georgia, which anyone who's been to Antarctica has probably heard of South Georgia. A lot of people who haven't been down there might be wondering where it is. So I definitely encourage anybody who is listening that is not familiar with South Georgia, pull up your Google Maps and check out where it's located, because it's very remote. And so I'm curious, because it's sort of a lesser known part of the world and it's so far down south, how did you first hear about the Artist in Residence program on South Georgia?
Well, it goes back quite a long way, over 2.5 years ago, really. That's prior to the residency. I first found out about these whaling stations on South Georgia, which are basically the remnants of this horrific industry that decimated the whale population in the 19th century. And once I'd seen that these places were just scattered along the coast of South Georgia in complete ramshackle, I was just thinking, that would be such an idyllic source of inspiration to make a series of paintings. And I just really wanted to get there, essentially. And I started looking for funding opportunities to get out there, initially to the Falkland Islands, and then potentially, hopefully, on to South Georgia, which is about 900 miles south of the Falklands, southeast. And I've spent a long, long time looking without much success, really, until I eventually stumbled on a scholarship on the Falkland Islands, which I applied for, went through probably several months worth of emails backwards and forwards, until the point when it just became clear that there wasn't enough funding available to get me and my equipment to the Falklands, let alone South Georgia. So it was a real shame when that all fell through, especially after all the effort I'd put in. But, it's amazing how when these things don't always work out initially, something else just comes in from the sideline. And I stumbled upon the South Georgia Heritage Trust, a fantastic charity that run a very unofficial residency program on South Georgia. And it was after contacting them that eventually we managed to agree a project where I could go down there and record these whaling stations.
Amazing. What an interesting journey to actually find yourself at that point then. Was it a long process to actually, from that initial contact with the South Georgia Heritage Trust to actually getting accepted and planning to go down?
Fairly, but in comparison to the initial approach that I took, it moved relatively quickly. It takes a process of planning out the project and pitching that to the charity, essentially persuading them that it's worth their while to have a young prancing artist like me running around South Georgia. And there were a few challenges involved as well, but that was probably something to get into later.
Yeah, for sure. Now, had you done any other remote residencies like this, or was this the first one in your artistic career?
It depends how you define remote, really. I've did a residency on the Isles of Scilly, which it's a tiny island south of Cornwall in the UK. And there's an island called Tresco, which I worked on for a family before. But that's probably about an hour's boat journey from the UK. So, that's not necessarily remote, despite the fact that there's not many people living there. So South Georgia is really it's quite hard to beat, to be honest.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you had to take a military flight, first of all, to get from the UK to the Falklands, and then after that, a ship to South Georgia, because there's no other way to get to South Georgia other than by vessel. And I read on one of your Instagram posts that the military in the UK managed to put all of your canvases, panels, and papers on the wrong plane, which ended up in Cyprus.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty tough pill to swallow right at the beginning of a residency that's so remote. How did you solve that problem?
Oh, it was so frustrating. There was 2 flights leaving the military base that day, and typically they managed to put my portfolio full of all my canvases and panels, art equipment, essentially, onto the wrong plane. And it was quite stressful figuring it all out. But I managed to come across this builder's merchants on the Falklands. And, I ended up buying this really weird plywood, really thin plywood from the builder's merchants on the Falklands, and something like radiator paint to prime the panels with. So it wasn't ideal, definitely not what the artist's world would consider archival in the industry. So it's definitely not something that I could sell, really, but they proved their purpose in, serving as a reference to work onto, a reference panel to work onto for small paintings to bring back to the studio after the residency to use as kind of a documentation for the larger works. So yeah, it worked out in the end.
And having been to the Falklands, I mean, because it's remote, there's also such a limited amount of materials that one can find there, right? Let alone specific artist materials. So it's wonderful that you were able to pull something together.
Yeah, it was interesting. Not ideal, but, it worked out in the end. So it was fine.
Good. So you had the benefit of staying or residing in the little, let's call it a little tiny village of Grytviken. It's extremely small, which, in itself is an abandoned whaling station. But how many other whaling stations were you able to visit and get to during your 2 months there?
Well, this is interesting because it was actually one of the real challenges in applying for this residency, because the whaling stations, aside from Grytviken, of which there are several, are all strictly forbidden in terms of nobody is allowed access to them without a regulated permit from the government. And that was a separate approach to applying to the residency and having to request permission to get access to these whaling stations from the government. So it was great when I'd been accepted onto this residency, but I still hadn't got that permission. And it was slightly worrying, really, in the fact that I might not be able to even get out of Grytviken, which is a great whaling station, but it's been made safe essentially for tourists to visit and walk around. So it's been absolutely gutted from its original state of being, having huge structures that are all collapsing and tumbling down. So basically had to persuade the government that it was worth their while to let, again, me, a young artist, wander around these dangerous sites for the reason of, culturally documenting these abandoned whaling stations. And that's how I approached it. That's what I said. These whaling stations have been photographed in the past. They have been drawn. I've seen a few drawings and paintings by artists before. They've been photographed in the past, but they're very much sort of mechanical means of documenting these places. And my pitch was that it's really important to get sort of the human, cultural, visual approach to documenting them, a much longer, sustained sort of observation of the whaling stations, if you like. And to my amazement, they actually agreed with me, and they agreed that these places haven't really been painted as a big project before. So it was given this permission for me to access these other whaling stations. Wow. The only problem then was that I had to use any transport that was already available or already planned to get to these whaling stations, meaning that I had to hook onto the back of projects that were already going on in South Georgia to get access to the stations. So it ended up being the rat eradication project that was being run on South Georgia. I managed to get access to Husvik, which is a fantastic example of a whaling station that's in its true sort of ruined state, and also Prince Olaf Harbour, which is one of the oldest whaling stations, one of the earliest to close. So that was really amazing.
Wow. So when you went with the rat eradication project, which we've spoken about on a previous episode with Sarah Lurcock from the South Georgia Heritage Trust, I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that they would go for short-ish periods of time over, because you have to go obviously by boat. So were there some time constrictions? Like would the rat eradication project, for example, take a boat over to Husvik and stay there just the day, and you'd be under this kind of time crunch to say, okay, well, I've got X amount of hours to paint something here, and then we're heading back? Or how did that work logistically?
Yeah, it was challenging. There was time limits inside the stations. I was lucky enough to get a night at Husvik, or at least staying in what they call the manager's villa, which is an accommodation that's been turned from a ruined shed essentially into an accommodable sort of habitable living space, but sort of anyway, it's got the basic facilities. So yeah, I had about a day and a half and a night at Husvik, and about probably 6 hours at Prince Olaf Harbour. So it was really limited time, but it worked. I managed to get enough sketches, enough resources in that time to sustain this ongoing project that's been running for about over a year now. And also about 6,000 photographs as well. So there's a lot to go through.
Goodness. Yeah, that is a lot. Can you talk us through the process a little bit of actually painting the ruins? Like, so you go out, you take sketches, you make sketches, you take photos. What happens next? Do you do any painting in situ, or are you primarily painting later on from the sort of initial sketches and things that you've collected?
That's more the case. Had I had more time inside the stations, I would have chosen to actually sit there for hours, making colour studies, much more observed, sustained studies of these compositions that I'd want to turn into, the paintings later down the line. But because of the time, I was essentially doing quick line drawings in the sketchbook, alongside photographs and notes that explained colours, what I saw, experiences, even smells in some cases, because the wildlife there absolutely stinks. And yeah, those sort of documents form this feed of memories that are surprisingly, when you look through these old sketchbooks, it really brings you back to that exact moment, much more so than a photograph ever could. And they're so useful when you're working up these drawings into larger paintings. It would be impossible without them.
Yeah, for sure. Did you have an actual artist's workspace where you were residing in Grytviken, so you could go out and get your sketches and things and then come back into the studio, so to speak, and start to create? Yeah.
I got this fantastic room above the museum at Grytviken, provided by Sarah Lurcock, the South Georgia Heritage Trust. And funnily enough, they had a few of their collections in there, and I've never had a studio that had whale skeletons and not whales and dolphin skeletons and all sorts. I think there was a decimated cat in there as well. So it was quite interesting working among all these animal carcasses, but it was a great space and it served its purpose. So I was no complaints from me.
Oh, that's amazing. What is it that you found most unexpected about your time on South Georgia?
That's a good question. My first reaction to that would probably be how well facilitated South Georgia is in terms of Grytviken and King Edward Point. You know, they've got everything they need there, from a hydroelectric power plant to get their electricity from, to massive toilet facilities, huge kitchens, a whole plumbing system. Initially, I just assumed I'd be going camping, essentially, but it was quite a nice surprise when I found out that they've got what I would call luxury, essentially, accommodation, and it was an absolute pleasure to be there.
Yeah, for sure. I couldn't agree more. Just remembering back to the first time that I arrived at South Georgia, because it's so remote, you arrive thinking everything's going to be so rustic. And there's just this really thriving, bustling little tiny little community of people that have such a wealth of stuff at their fingertips. So yeah, and you mentioned earlier, everything is very well managed. The South Georgia Heritage Trust is really plugged into and open to projects such as yours. The government of South Georgia is very open as well. And I think that's part of what makes it such a unique place. The people who were involved in South Georgia, both politically and culturally, are so passionate at making it, making it the gem that it is, making it the real pearl, the place that, when people go there, they never forget it. It's just so unique.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, actually. I was slightly worried about going initially because I was going to be such an outsider compared to everyone else who was there, who, had a specific job to do there with clear aims and clear, results that would come from that. And something like the project I was doing is a much sort of more open to it's hard to explain it. It's much more vague in a sense. And I was a bit worried that they wouldn't really accept something so ambiguous into their lives, essentially. But it was such a nice surprise when I got there to see that they were actually really pleased to have a new face on South Georgia and hear about the project and what I was doing. And some of the people that work there have actually bought the painting since, which is probably the biggest compliment you can possibly give. So it's really nice.
Oh, that's really wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you have an experience from your time on South Georgia that has stood out as the most memorable for you?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I was lucky enough to be there over Christmas and New Year, which also includes my birthday as well, which is on the 3rd of January. And one of the most outstanding memories of my life, essentially, was when I was lucky enough to get a boat out to a place called St. Andrews Bay, where there's a huge king penguin colony. And it happened to be on my birthday as well, which made it even more crazy. And we stayed out in this little hut on St. Andrews Bay and basically got to spend the whole day wandering around this amazing beach full of elephant seals, fur seals, king penguins. And it was funny because there's quite strict rules about how close you're allowed to get to this wildlife, which I obeyed quite respectfully. But once you're sitting there with a sketchbook for an hour or so, it's the animals breaking the rules, not you, because they're the ones that come up to you and start investigating, So it's quite amazing having literally penguins looking over your shoulder and sort of being very inquisitive. So yeah, absolutely incredible experience.
Oh, that sounds so wonderful. And what a fortuitous thing that it ended up being on your birthday.
Yeah, amazing. I couldn't believe it.
So you've referred to your paintings of the whaling stations as your most ambitious project yet. What is currently happening with the work that you produced while on the island?
There's already been a lot that's already happened, and there's still things to come. And before I go into that too much, I just also want to make it clear that these paintings aren't made for my own purposes as much as they're made for this charity, the South Georgia Heritage Trust. All of these exhibitions that I'm having and have had, I've been absolutely making it clear that it's the South Georgia Heritage Trust that have made this possible, and it's them that are doing these fantastic projects on South Georgia and, being so beneficial to this amazing place. And it's not at all a celebration of the whaling industry. It's much more a case of taking this kind of horrific past and using what's happened as an opportunity to not only document that heritage, but also try and raise awareness and money where possible for the charity to restore the sort of habitats that have been damaged by the whaling industry. So to do that, I've organised so far 4 exhibitions that have happened. One was in Cardiff, the capital of where I'm based, Wales. There's an exhibition currently happening right now on the Falkland Islands at the Maritime Museum there. And they've been really supportive of the project as well. And ever since I started approaching the Heritage Trust to organise this, there's been an exhibition at the museum on South Georgia. So that's happened, and that was great. That was really well received. And also at the Museum of Modern Art in Wales, which was a fantastic show. Really, really happy to get that. And there's still shows to come as well. The next one will be in 2021. So planning ahead there at the Discovery Centre in Dundee. And basically they're showing the paintings that I've worked up since I've got back from South Georgia in the studio, which are big sort of textural oil paintings, essentially, which are scenes of the whaling stations and various compositions that I've brought back from the experience to turn into these paintings.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. It's so wonderful to hear that not only are you using your art to create awareness and to support, as you say, these sort of regenerative programs that the South Georgia Heritage Trust is doing, but that from one short stint of 2 months, you're able to extend the benefits so far into the future. You know, you're still doing stuff up until 2021. And yeah, it's like the art allows the work that you, or the time that you spent there, to live on well beyond that time, which is really great.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, it'd be nice if it could just carry on as well. You know, if someone offered me a South Georgia related show in 10 years, I would definitely not turn it down. And, you know, I'm hoping to keep that benefit for the charity going essentially for the rest of my life. You know, and I've also put a book together about the project, and that goes into detail about the whole application process. It's got photographs from the whaling stations as well as all the paintings from the collection. So, you know, that'll always be available, and it's just doing as much as I can to make as much as possible from this experience.
Wonderful. Well, you never know who's going to be listening to the podcast a few years down the road. It might turn into some more opportunities. But in the meantime, where can people find out more about your work? Where can they buy the book? Where are the online spaces that people can find you?
Well, the main go-to place is my website, essentially, which is www.crutchley-mack.com. But also, I think if you just put into a Google search, you know, artist whaling stations, Theo Crutchley-Mack, you'd probably find something as well. And the website has a catalogue, which has all of the paintings available to see, and also a page that's got the book where you can look at that. And it's all on there. Or if not, then come along to one of the exhibitions, you know, they're all listed on the website as well. And that's makes so much difference, actually being able to see the work in person as opposed to on a screen, you know, actually see the texture in the work and see sort of the scale of it in real life. It's much better than seeing it on a screen, but everything's on the website anyway, and also Instagram and Facebook.
Excellent. Well, we will definitely put links in the show notes so that people can just click through and find out more about you. This has really been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us. And just thanks for being on the Antarctic Stories podcast.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Antarctic Stories. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you have an extra minute, leaving a rating or review for the podcast will really help us in reaching a wider audience. Antarctic Stories is a production of Twin Tracks Expeditions, a family-run agency of polar guides who have spent the last decade working on polar expedition ships. We bring you unparalleled insider expertise in small ship voyages to the Arctic and Antarctica, and we love sharing our insider knowledge to help you find the perfect ship for your next polar expedition. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or at twintracksexpeditions.com.